Hi everyone, welcome to our online training series. Today we're going to be talking about an evidence-based practice called explicit instruction. Explicit instruction is synonymous with direct instruction, and it is a phenomenal learning tool that we can use to support students across all spectrums of learning, but especially those students that might display behaviors, including some acting out behaviors, in our classrooms. If you'd like to access the slides, you can use the bit.ly link at the bottom. And if you are doing this as part of our online training series, you can find a hyperlink in the training document. So when we're talking about explicit instruction, otherwise known as direct instruction, there is a phenomenal text that you can absolutely use to build capacity in the use of explicit instruction. It's by Dr. Anita Archer and Charles Hughes and has excellent resources. There is also a website that Anita Archer created with the same name that is also hyperlinked in the training resources document and has some phenomenal videos at both the elementary and secondary level showing Dr. Archer providing instruction to students using the explicit instruction method. Explicit instruction, sometimes known as direct instruction, has a phenomenally large evidence base that includes both academic instruction and teaching behaviors. So here I've hyperlinked in an article from the What Works Clearinghouse that shows how explicit instruction has been used to reduce problem behaviors in elementary school classrooms. There are many other phenomenal resources at the What Works Clearinghouse website, so you absolutely would be spending good time to go and check out the resources there. When we're talking about explicit instruction, there are 16 elements, and when we break it all down, and they focus on the four larger areas of content, design, delivery, and practice. We're going to go through each of the elements separately and discuss how we can use those to support students with behaviors. So as we're talking today and thinking through how we can use explicit instruction, I'd encourage you to stop and think through each step how each of the 16 elements can be used to support not only all students in our classroom, but specifically students who might display the E side or that emotional side of EBD, as well as the students who display that behavior side of EBD. As each element pops up, it's not a bad idea to have a T-chart in front of you and take some notes for how these elements really can provide students with the deep support and strategies that can help them be successful in our classroom. So when we're talking about explicit instruction, what we're really talking about is a very systematic instructional approach that looks at both the design and delivery procedures. It's all based out of effective school research and is a very, very specific, direct approach to teaching. There should not be any ambiguity in the instructional design. Students should never wonder, or other adults, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? It should be very clear from the second our instruction begins until the end that there is a systematic, methodological, evidence-based practice at play in our classrooms. There is a very significant evidence base to support students with disabilities. For example, this article from the Teaching Exceptional Children 2016 issue that looked at how we could use explicit instruction to support working memory. I'd highly encourage you to check out this article. It has great ideas for use in our classrooms. We know that quality teaching is the single most important factor in our classroom, side by side with the importance of building positive, powerful relationships with students. The quality of our teaching is what's going to change the trajectory for students with disabilities. In fact, there is such strong evidence behind it that if you look at Hattie's work and synthesis of the research, and we know that 0.4 is a single year's worth of growth for students Direct instruction has a 0.6 effect size, so more than a year's worth of growth when we teach in our classrooms using this methodology. The very first element, we're looking at the area of content, is to ensure that all of our lessons focus instruction on the critical content. As Anita Archer says, cut the fluff and teach the stuff. This is absolutely true of instructional content delivery. It is also true of us teaching behavioral expectations. And sometimes where we make a teacher assumption that dramatically negatively impacts student learning is we're assuming that students have the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in all the behavioral expectations that we have at any grade. So whether that's the ability to communicate with another person, my wants and needs, whether that's the ability to work in a small group or to navigate successfully in the hallways. How do I handle a situation that is stressful for me? We're assuming that students have the skills, or we're providing some kind of an incidental piece of information, but we're not teaching students those very critical life skills using explicit instruction. So when we're going to go in and teach a student what they need to do to be successful in a social situation, in the classroom, or working with peers, we need to focus our instruction on the critical content and make sure that students know step by step what they need to do to be successful. We also want to make sure that we're sequencing skills logically. So thinking through all of the things a student needs to do to be successful in the hallway. Have I prioritized easier skills before I teach the harder skills? Have I worked on those high frequency skills, the things they're most likely to encounter in the hallway, before I look at the low frequency skills? Am I thinking through the prerequisite skills? For example, if I say use nice words, have the nice words already been defined? Do they already have a full vocabulary of what are considered nice words at school? Have we also separated out similar skills? Because my appropriate hallway behavior might look very different than my appropriate playground behavior. So I want to teach those at different times and make sure that I teach them both explicitly so that students have the skills they need. And I'm going to make sure that I do that in a logical, sequential order for students. Next, when I'm looking at content, we want to make sure that we're breaking down those very complex skills and strategy into much smaller instructional units. Often with students, we're giving them so much information that we're putting students in a state of what we call cognitive overloading, or giving them so many processing demands that there's no way that they can store that information in their working memory. So taking everything they need to do to be successful in a small group activity and then starting our instruction very logically in a very small way so that students can have those bite-sized chunks of knowledge to be successful. We know that within our realm of supporting students with disabilities, that also involves taking some really great data so that we know where the student was, their baseline data, before we started our intervention. Then we're going to provide that explicit instruction, which is one of these specially designed instruction methodologies we can use, take data through that process, and then take data over time to make sure that small chunk of learning the student had, that it's making a significant impact in their behavior over time. A quick suggestion, a lot of times we see behavior when we call on students to answer questions in class, and our focus is on right answers, which causes students to do what I call stand at a fork in the road, and that we all stand at forks in the road all day long with every decision we make, where we can choose to provide instruction in one method or the other. For example, I can choose to give you all 15 steps or just 2 steps. All these forks in the road, students stand at these forks also. And if I ask a student a question for which I and the students perceive there is only one right answer, the fork in the road students often come to is, I'm not sure I'm right. I can either choose to look dumb in front of my peers, is how they're thinking, or I can choose to look cool in front of my peers. Many times our students choose cool, which isn't a socially or school appropriate behavior. So if we want to stop making those forks in the road happen for our students, we can teach a universally designed for learning, or UDL approach, for all students at all times as our procedures in our classroom, that for any question that's asked, our students always have 4 choices. Our students can choose to ask another question. Oh, you asked me, Laura, what is 4 plus 2? And I'd like to ask the question, and is it okay if we get out our manipulatives? Can we work that problem out together? And I, as the teacher, will honor that question and work through that question with my students. I can invite my students to make a comment about the question. Laura, what is 4 plus 2? Yeah, thanks, Mrs. Clarke, for asking me that question. I really think this would be a great question that we could draw out. What does everyone think about that, right? Comment on the problem. 4 plus 2 reminds me of another question that I answered last week. Can we talk about that question? Students can give their thoughts about that. Wow, in looking at the math process, you asked me what 4 plus 2 is, and that question, yeah, I think that may be something we could use a number line for, right? Or they could choose to respond to that question, but they've got multiple opportunities, multiple ways they can engage without having to choose a right or a wrong answer. We're going to move to the next steps, or next parts of our elements in explicit instruction. We're going to start looking at design elements. So the first design element is looking at our lessons and making sure that our lessons are organized and focused. So we're on topic and we don't have any irrelevant digressions. I just told a story that fit in, hopefully in your minds and my mind, with my overall lesson theme, but we want to make sure that we tie that back in to the learning target of the day so students don't just feel like, wow, she told me a story and I have no idea how that fits in my lesson. We also want to make sure that we begin our lessons with a clear statement of the learning goals, sometimes known as learning intentions, our success criteria, but whatever you are sharing with your students, your I can statement, and we're making sure that students understand that this is the purpose of our learning today. So I can add 2-digit numbers. That's the purpose of my lesson, and everything that comes out of my mouth and that is presented in the next 15 or 20 minutes should focus on that very specific intentional learning target. We also want to make sure that we're reviewing prior skills and knowledge. So before we begin instruction on today's learning target, we're going to make sure that we've tied in the learning that came before. This is one element of retrieval practice, and we know that our research on the brain tells us that retrieval practice is crucial to students moving their knowledge into long-term memory where they can retrieve that information over and over again. So always making sure before I begin today's lesson, let's talk about what we did yesterday, a quick review of content, and that content retrieval should be interactive. So whether we're having students use their whiteboards to engage, whether we're having students do a thumbs up, thumbs down, share in a think, pair, share, or some other cooperative strategy, but a quick review of prior skills and knowledge that is interactive and requires students to retrieve knowledge. We can also make sure that we are providing step-by-step demonstrations so that students know and can see what is expected when we're looking at mastery of a learning target, but that it's very sequential, step-by-step. We want to make sure our language is clear, it is concise, students aren't having to guess what we mean, but that our lesson has been designed in a way that students are absolutely sure what the mastery for the lesson is and that they can reach that. One way to do that is to ensure that we're giving a very adequate range of examples and non-examples. And within those examples and non-examples, we want to make sure that that's part of the student's experiences and understanding. So we're giving relevant examples for the age and grade of our students and our students' life experiences, but that there's a very adequate range so that students can at least identify with one example and a non-example. We also want students to be able to tell us why that example or non-example fits. So for example, A non-example of an answer for 4 plus 2 is 8. But can students tell us why that is a non-example? Can they show me why that is a non-example? Maybe using a set of manipulatives. Can they verbally describe that? Can they use a number line to show that? So a wide variety of examples and non-examples. As instructors, we want to make sure that we're providing students with both guided and supportive practice. So a non-example of this is to say, okay, everybody, I've just solved 4 plus 2. It's 6. All right, off you go. Finish 100 problems on your own. That is not guided or supported practice. But we're using the steps, for example, of maybe I do, so I might solve a few problems, then we do. As a group, we're going to solve those same problems. That's a really successful strategy because students already know the answers to those problems. So if they are solving 4 plus 2 and they get 10, they're like, nope, I'm looking on the board and that was 6. Let me go back and see or ask for help as to why I didn't arrive at the same answer. The key to making sure that we're providing this is giving students what we call practice turns and feedback, which means you get a turn, I get a turn, you get a turn, and I get a turn, and you get immediate feedback. Feedback 3 days later does not help a student improve their learning trajectory, but immediate feedback. I'm seeing 4 plus 2 and you've written 8. Let's go through and count that out together, that immediate feedback, so that they know that they came to an incorrect conclusion and we're going to help them get to the correct conclusion. Makes a difference in our students' learning. We want to consider in the next group of elements our delivery. And so the first delivery element that we're going to look at is requiring frequent responses. Whether these responses are verbal, written, or action-oriented responses, like using response cards, we know that frequent responding, A, increases engagement, B, keeps students on task, lets us know in the immediacy how students are doing with the learning, and lets students get that immediate feedback. Right, correct, incorrect. I'm on the right track. I need to correct my trajectory, right? Requiring frequent responses, an awesome way. When we're looking at students with significant behavior, so this can also be an element where students might show some acting out behaviors. Almost always the acting out behaviors happen because students are not sure they are correct and they do not want to be embarrassed in front of peers. So we want to ensure that our feedback to students is supportive of the learning process and in no way embarrassing. Wrong answer! No, that's not correct. These are non-examples, things we don't want to do to our students that inhibit that relationship that we're trying to build with students. Those responses also cause students to be concerned that they are going to be publicly humiliated in our classrooms. We don't want that. We're building relationships with students. So we want to make sure that when we require frequent responses, that we have a respectful system in place so that students feel safe to answer, safe to engage, and know that they are good to go. For students that have significant behaviors, sometimes in their learning process, they don't really have a motivation to want to engage with us, right? Over time, they've learned the behavior of trying to get out of work, and that's been a successful strategy for them. So to re-engage some students in the learning process, just the work itself or having us say good job is not enough of a motivation. And so when I think of that, I think a lot of times of us and our paycheck. You know, when we tell kids, you should just be motivated to do it because I asked it, then I would ask us this question. Would I be motivated to come into my classroom every day if I did not receive a paycheck? I might come in once or twice. I might volunteer for a function. I might come in and set up my classroom because I like to do that. And I might come in 1 or 2 days extra because I am a good soul and I like to participate in my community. Would I come in every day? I'm going to say the answer to that is no, without the motivation of a paycheck. So our students sometimes don't have a paycheck. coming in, and we might need to look at that. So whether we're offering some kind of an additional extrinsic motivator to engage in the learning process, and I would say in my head, that's a lot like a paycheck, and we need to provide those for students that need them. When we're looking at our delivery, we want to make sure we're monitoring student performance closely. We want to watch what they're doing, we want to listen to their logic and thinking, and we want to engage in the learning process. I chose a picture of what to me is a non-example. We do not want students to think that while we're monitoring their performance that we're creeping around the room or that we're looking to catch them being bad. Aha, you're off task. Get back to work. Get your pencil out. What are you doing? Right? Those are some great non-examples of monitoring student performance. I would encourage us to think about monitoring student performance as a relationship building tool. If we are monitoring student performance to help students engage in the learning process and develop a love for content, and for them to see that we are a supportive part of their learning process, another tool that they have in their toolbox, then we're really changing the game for all students, but especially students that might display some acting out behavior. So when we're talking about monitoring student performance closely, that to me means engaging in the learning, being up and moving around the classroom, not sitting at a table or at my desk, but I'm right in the middle of the learning process and I'm asking questions like, oh, this is really interesting to me how you drew this problem out. Can you tell me more about this process? Or wow, when I'm looking at your paper, I'm really thinking about how much you've done already on this process, and I'm wondering about the next step and what you're going to do. I can't wait to see what you decide as your next path, right? Now I'm engaging with you in the learning process, supporting your learning. Another element of delivery is to make sure that we're providing immediate, affirmative, and corrective feedback. We want to make sure that our feedback is relational. We're building relationships with students, and that's where that affirmative word is critical. When our feedback is negative or seen as punitive, that's when we see a lot of acting out behaviors in the classroom. So we want to make sure that our feedback students see we're engaging right away, but that we're here to support their learning by using positive words, asking questions, wondering about their learning, seeing if another tool would help support their learning. What can we do to build those bridges? We want to make sure that our instruction is delivered at a brisk pace, that we're organized and ready to go, and we move through the lesson so that students know there's no lag or downtime, but we're continuing the learning process. We also want to make sure that while we're moving at a brisk pace, that at any point in the learning, students could stop, ask a question in an appropriate way that we would have taught, because we're going to teach those skills and strategies of students through explicit instruction, but that our lesson keeps moving. We also want to make sure we're helping students organize knowledge. I like to think about this as our brain closet. If students don't have an organized and systematic way to store knowledge in their brains, and we haven't taught them using retrieval practice how to retrieve that content knowledge, instead of seeing a brain closet like this, which is like, oh, glorious and beautiful, our students have every single one of those items in a big heap on the floor, and they're trying to dig through this huge mound of stuff to try and get to one little bitty piece of knowledge that they often cannot retrieve. So we can help students organize knowledge by building on prior knowledge, by giving them examples and non-examples. To tie that all together, I think of all of those elements as different hangers and shelves in their brain closet, where we're teaching students how to go in and retrieve that information over and over again. We have moved through a lot of the elements. We're up at 15, only one left to go. I've hyperlinked in 2 videos that go into Anita Archer's website on explicit instruction. You can see the videos there, but I've hyperlinked you to get there quicker. Looking at some decoding and vocabulary review, and it would be a great idea to look through these 15 elements plus the 16th element that's coming up to see how Anita delivers instruction and to take a chance to see how that might align with your instructional practices. So our last phenomenal element, the 16th element, is practice. And we want to make sure that we provide both distributed and cumulative practice. So distributed practice is that spaced practice that builds long-term retention. So over time, we're going to continue to provide spaced practice for content knowledge. Cumulative practice is less frequent, builds that long-term retention, and helps students put together every single thing that they've learned, where distributed practice might be looking at a smaller piece of an instructional lesson. If you want to know more, I've hyperlinked in another phenomenal video, this one on retrieval practice. So to sum it all up, there are 16 phenomenal elements broken down into smaller pieces when we're looking at explicit instruction that we can use to both teach academic content and behavioral expectations. When we use explicit instruction in the classroom, it declutters our lessons, it increases opportunities for students to engage with us, and it also increases their ability to be successful in the classroom, which decreases acting out behaviors. I hope this has piqued your interest on explicit instruction. There are phenomenal resources where you can take much deeper dives. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We know that if students are not engaged and they're not learning the content we had planned, and we spend a lot of time planning our content. So like all three images below, where their students are just seeming not interested, they've given up in defeat, or are throwing things around our room, we want to have best practices in our pocket, like explicit instruction, which has such a large evidence base to support student learning. We know that if our behavior system isn't working, it's often because our lessons aren't engaging, and we know that the lessons aren't sticking because the behaviors keep happening. So jump into explicit instruction, give it a quick dive, make it a manageable chunk. Just choose one of the 16 elements to start, and reach out if you've got other questions. We've got lots more training coming up, so dive in anytime you'd like by going to our website and checking out our calendar. Happy learning!